Last time we talked about the first several chapters of the book, and sort of raced through the uh, the third and fourth chapters. The third chapter was about the dismantling, what I think she calls the dismantling of Brown, as in the Brown. Oh, no, she calls it burning Brown to the ground, as in Brown versus the Board of Education, and the responses after Brown, the legislative responses across the states to try to essentially undo the work of Brown. Um, and then the part that I want to just spend a little bit of time on tonight, because we raced through it so quickly last time, was chapter 4, which is rolling back civil rights. And then we can go back and we can look at, then we'll talk about the last couple of chapters. What I think happened with her, I think she had the chapter on the Obama presidency, and then they told her she needed an epilogue, and she just, rather than write an epilogue, she just cut off the last third of the chapter about the Obama presidency and called it an epilogue. Because essentially it just reads as one chapter. But in any event, we'll talk about that. I will say that one thing, my approach as a rabbi to talking about issues in the public sphere is generally, I mean, I put my cards on the table. There's no sense in trying to disguise the fact that I'm as I say, a flaming liberal. But I also try to, I try not to be partisan. I try to, as much as I can. And in reading this book, I mean, it's especially the last chapter, the last couple of chapters. If there's anybody who's part of this discussion who is a Republican, um, I can see that person feeling like there's only part of the story being told here. So I'll say a couple things about that. One is that, we should, as I said last time, we should read everything we read critically. And in fact, I read her 5th chapter, I read quite critically. And I actually have some criticisms that about the way she used some of the sources that she used, because in some cases, some of the voter suppression stuff is a little more complicated than she indicates it is. But in general, we should read everything critically. And so, obviously, I wouldn't be presenting this book if I didn't think it was essentially, worthwhile. But for sure there are other narratives, and I think it's important, even when you agree with sources, if there's we don't have time to do this with everything, but on topics you really care about, we should be ruthless on both sides, and so that's first. The second more difficult truth is that certainly on race issues, I don't think you can take partisanship out of it. It just is there. Now, one can say, and this is, I think, a very important next point. One can say that there are ways of talking about race that don't buy into the Democratic Party's proposals to the solutions. There are thoughtful conservatives who care about race and racial equality and racial justice, who are critical of Democratic policies for precisely the reason that they believe that they make things worse and not better. So, we're not addressing that, but I just wanted to get that out there. But there's kind of no way around it. The party that has been most involved with attempts to suppress Black votes and has been most involved in trying to dismantle what we know of as civil rights is the Republican Party. Now, there are other, the Republican Party is obviously not only about fighting against, promoting suppression of the black vote any more than the Democratic Party is primarily about, trying to uplift black people. There's a whole bunch of other reasons that a person might be a Republican, obviously, and to be a conservative. But the history is there, and it's complex, and we have to wrestle with it. And my hope, even though I am a flaming liberal, my hope is that the Republican Party will come through this abysmal presidency and go through a process of purification and remember what conservatism is, and rediscover a healthy conservatism that it can bring to the national discourse, because I think that that's beneficial. But there's a lot of stuff that it's got to work on before it can offer alternatives to racial justice or any number of other social issues that offer something to the idea of the public good. I guess my take, and it's probably not fair because there's no one here to answer it, my take is that the Republican Party has lost the sense of how to contribute to the public good. It knows what it's against, but it no longer has an affirmative voice of what is in the service of the public good. Anyway, I'm off topic, but I'm just naming that because it's there. You can't read this without feeling that she's indicting the Republican Party as a whole. So I wanted to get that out there. Any comments or questions about that before we dive in? That's not our main topic, but I wanted to just give you a chance to respond.
We concur.
Right. Well,
is there anybody on the other side?
I was going to say, we concur and we don't apologize for concurring.
I agree.
Well, I'm always most uncomfortable when people agree with me. So I'll just say that.
I will say, hey, Rabbi, I will say, you could say that's the modern Republican Party, if you want to say from Nixon forward, or maybe even go back to Eisenhower. But the Democratic Party has a long history of racism, and I think we're actually getting into the weeds, and not into the nuts and bolts, which are, really kind of just how insidious these logical arguments are to rational people. And really, I think, like kind of what to talk about for tonight, and not necessarily politics per se.
I hear you, but I'm going to push back though. I'm going to push back because, first of all, to be really clear, for sure, the Democratic Party does not have the answers to racial justice in our country, because we've had a couple of seasons when we've had a Democratic president and we've had Democratic Congress and Senate, and lo and behold, we still had racial problems in our country. And absolutely, there are deep roots of racism in the Democratic Party for sure. But I don't think, and again, I'm making a distinction between conservatism and the Republican Party. But right. you cannot read her 4th chapter, which I'll show you in a moment, just to remind you. And I know you're a careful reader, Eric, and I know you've read the book. You cannot read it without following the narrative that happens to break down along political, Republican Party and Democratic Party lines. So it's not my desire to go out and on some anti-Republican Party thing, but I'm just naming what's there, because I think to pretend to talk about it without being able to name fundamentally important differences in the parties is, I think, just disingenuous. I don't think you can do it. Now, sorry, go ahead.
No, look, you're preaching to the choir, but I'll just tell you,
right?
Like, we're just as guilty of, the narrative of super predators and the racism that is implicit behind that,
right?
As Reagan was before,
right?
And there is no lack of us not really, it's like none of us were woke, none of us knew.
Right.
And I think actually, that's kind of what I think is not like how we became woke, but it's like these narratives of, well, this is just a crime of the inner city is a code
Right.
word for dog whistle for, you know, the Black community. And we are as guilty
Yep.
propagating that as any Republican has been.
Yes,
And,
absolutely.
and so that's my point here.
I hear you. Now I understand. Now I understand what you're saying. Right. So what I would say, just to zoom out a little bit. So now I appreciate the point you're making, and it's a very important one. So one of the things that I was going to do in the latter half of the conversation, and I will do, is shift from politics to, and I don't really have a name for what the other thing is, the kind of broad cultural economic biases that we're all implicated in. Because, you know, what is striking about this book, or sorry, it's not striking, what has to be named about this book is that it doesn't purport to be a history of race in America. It purports to be, as I said last time, a history of how racial policies played out among, you know, formal political institutions, among the kind of political elites in the United States. And that's only one part, significant part, but it's only one part of the problem, right? Because even if, you know, for sure, if we were all to read this and say, well, I didn't support any of those policies, so I'm doing my part, we would all be woefully mistaken. And I think that's your point. We have to look for the other ways in which we have been connected to, passively or actively, policies and aspects of our culture that are racist. So yeah, I hear you. Okay. Having said all that, let's dive into the fourth chapter where she bashes the Republican Party mercilessly. No, I said half tongue in cheek, but let's just touch on it because you know, the 1980s was an incredibly important time in her narrative anyway, because in the 1980s, well, it's actually, she really dates this to the early 1970s with the Nixon administration. But if I'm reading her correctly, she kind of suggests that it was at that point that you could no longer be explicitly racist, and that you start to get these policies that there starts to be a debate, these debates that are fraught with racial tension that don't appear to be about race. And Eric, you just gave one actually from the other side, which is the whole super predator. You know, like the word super predator. Who would want to be near a super predator, right? That sounds pretty. You know, oh, we're just talking about crime. We're talking about dangerous crime. We want everyone to be safe. That doesn't sound like a racist trope. So she begins to shift into that, and I think she marks that shift in American discourse, which is hugely important to Nixon and then Reagan. So having said all that, let's just do a brief overview of chapter 4. So I'm in part reminding myself, but also reminding you. One of the central points that comes up in this fourth chapter is that the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, which were massive accomplishments that overcame a huge amount of opposition, and were passed, as you all know, in the late 1950s and then strengthened in the 1960s. That those slowly came under fire by Reagan and by the Republican Party in the 1980s. And here's where she discusses what I was just saying a moment ago. Cheryl, will you read this, the second key maneuver?
The second key maneuver, which flowed naturally from the first, was to redefine racism itself. Confronted with civil rights headlines depicting unflattering portrayals of KKK rallies and jackbooted sheriffs, white authority transformed those damning images of white supremacy into the sole definition of racism.
Right. So One thing that, so I think that this is, well, sorry, let's read this one other thing, and then I want to offer a reflection. If you read this highlighted one at the top of
Sure.
the right-hand column.
Okay, the focus on the Klan also helped to designate racism as an individual aberration rather than something systemic, institutional, and pervasive.
So this is a important and very, very difficult thing to talk about, because she, well, she's read and thought much more about this than I have, for sure, but she makes it sound as though this was sort of some backroom 5-dimensional chess decision, that, like, okay, we're gonna make everyone think that the only real racism is lynching and people wearing bed sheets. And in the meantime, we're going to do this other thing that people won't recognize as racist. And I don't, and she offers one or two quotes at pieces of evidence of people who actually do make it sound that it was very deliberate. I just think that people are more complicated than that. And I think that especially this top bit gets to something that's very, very significant in terms of a difference between people on the political left and people on the political right, which is that in general, people on the political left buy into an analysis of culture and history and institutions that seeks to explain social problems through the lens of the fault of those economic systems and political institutions. Whereas in general, people on the right tend to bristle at that kind of analysis and to focus on the individual as being kind of the prime source of moral right and wrong, individual decision making as being the primary source of right and wrong. So does it make sense whether you agree with me? Do you hear what I'm saying, or am I just talking in circles here?
I'll agree.
Okay. But you know what I'm saying. That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay. I'll agree with the second part, actually, about the partisan political viewpoints. I'm not going to agree with you about the idea that there wasn't anybody in the back room.
In the back room, right.
Specifically, very carefully planning this stuff, although the effects on the larger population, those people aren't necessarily doing backroom manipulations. They've been manipulated, I would say. But I would say absolutely.
Okay, fair point. Fair point. So, right. So it just taking your, so right. So it sounds like we agree. Sounds like Cheryl agrees that there, at least in the mass population level, there is not necessarily a deliberate embrace of a decision to pursue policies that are explicitly racist, but they seem to me to be inextricably linked with how one sides on the wisdom of implicating institutions. So like, is the United States, the question of whether the United States is a fundamentally racist country is going to go to whether how important you believe history and culture is into determining institutions. If you think it's less important, then you're going to believe that individuals over time can overcome the limitations of those institutions. And if you're not, you think that the institutions themselves have to be fixed and changed. So anyway, I'm just pointing this out because I think that this is a huge, huge, huge deal. And it's the reason that so many people can accurately say in our culture, well, I don't have racist views and I'm not actively doing anything against Black people, so I'm off the hook. Like, why are you pointing the finger at me and telling me that I'm part of a racist system? And I think it's very hard for our culture to talk about these kinds of things. Yeah, Cheryl.
I'd like to inject into our discussion the idea that assigning the label racist to people or systems or whatever is a really counterproductive enterprise. And I would love to have everybody, when they're talking about, you know, any of these issues, to stop using the word racist and say, what effect does this have on actual people?
Great.
When
Okay.
you do this, what happens?
Okay, so I want to come, so wait, if I understand you correctly, you're saying you object to that term being used as being not very effective.
Yeah, and it's not like I don't believe there is racism, but I think if you talk to people about whether they're racist or not, or whether the society is racist or not, you're just running around in circles. It's not what's the important thing.
Right. Yeah. And very, very few people, although there are some, will say, you're right, I'm racist. Right. If you have
Well, there are some, yeah.
it doesn't really, you know, if you're accusing somebody of holding a view that is tainted with racism, very, very few people are going to say, because they don't believe, they're not going to say, yeah, you're right, I'm racist, you got me. Although there are, unfortunately, more of those people in our society than we'd probably like there to be. But in any event, now the reason I want to come back to this is one of the things that I want to discuss later is I want to talk about how difficult it can be to begin to deepen one's understanding of these issues and to try to be an ally, because often well, always, white folks don't get to choose the terminology that's being used, and we're often asked to think, to revisit our own assumptions, even about what it means to be an ally. So I don't necessarily disagree with you, but I just want to come back to that point later because it fits in with something I think is so important. Okay, then she starts to go into a little bit of detail about. She seems to me to like zero in on giving an example of what were some of the policy discussions that didn't sound like they were racist, but that she's arguing were actually deeply anti-Black. And so she talks about the Reagan talking about slum dwellers and talking about this faceless mass waiting for handouts. And she says essentially that American political discourse became very, very encoded with race. And it was often not at all apparent what was being talked about. But once in a while, it would be quite obvious. If we think about the Willie.
And to some people, it was always quite obvious all the time.
Right, right. Yeah, I think that's important to say. But that was kind of mostly in that I mean, there's a lot in the chapter, but in any event, there's just a couple of things I wanted to focus on. She talks about this part, the Southern strategy, which is probably a phrase that you know if you follow American politics, although maybe not. But she says, like Wallace, that is George Wallace, Richard Nixon tapped into this general resentment, that is the resentment of white folks. The Southern strategy, as his campaign handlers called it, was designed to pull into the GOP, that is the Republican Party, not only white Democratic voters from below the Mason-Dixon line, but also those aggrieved whites who lived in northern working class neighborhoods. So the Southern strategy is sometimes misunderstood as being a phrase that describes the shift, the deliberate shift to bring in Southern voters to the Republican Party. But it also it's really was about white resentment in the South and the North, and trying to allow the Republican Party to speak to that. Oh, this is a little bit of an aside, but the phrase "bleeding heart liberal," I didn't realize that. I think that came from this time, which probably means it was the work of, what was the name of that? William Safire, who was, I believe, Richard Nixon's speechwriter. I'll bet you anything he came up with "bleeding heart liberal." That was interesting. Okay, sorry, very much off topic, or at least not that relevant. Okay, I guess really I don't want to spend too much more time on this chapter because I want to talk about her last chapter. Anybody else want to say anything about this chapter? Anything I'm skipping over that's really important? Okay. The other thing that begins to emerge in the last chapter and in this current chapter 4 that we're reading is the Voting Rights Act and the battle for empowering African Americans at the voting booth. That had already become in the in the old world, it was, in the post-Civil War era, it was very obviously, explicitly a battle to literally violently keep Black people from voting, but it became a more complicated legal battle in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s as it kind of shifted to constitutional grounds and was not about forcefully preventing African Americans, at gunpoint from voting. But the voting, which will be so much a part of the chapter that we're about to discuss, was already an issue in the 1980s. She also, if you remember, she also talks about public school access. This begins this continues her discussion of Brown versus the Board of Education. Black access to quality public schools drifted further and further away. And she talks about the famous 1978 case. I don't even know how to pronounce this guy's name, but this was the challenge against affirmative action, which is a topic I don't really want to go into because I believe it's very complicated. I'm going to pause because I heard somebody saying something.
Yeah, I think his name was pronounced Baki.
Oh, Baki?
Yeah, okay. I remember that case.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, that was a hugely important a cornerstone case. Okay. I actually did look this guy up, and he's still around. He's very, very quiet and stays out of the spotlight, which is probably wise. Okay. So I'm going to leave that there, but I do want to underscore the fact that that by the end of the 1980s, the education, employment, voting, and social welfare systems become battlegrounds that are fraught with racial division. And her argument is that this was just a different guise of white rage, a different expression of white rage and resentment, and a continued undercutting of the possibility and promise of Black democratic power that had emerged after the Civil War. And so sort of she presents the 1980s as being kind of the rejuvenation of the powers that were fighting continuously against African-American power since the Civil War, which is incredible to say, but that really is her argument. And okay, so now what I want to do is I want to just talk about this chapter, how to unelect a Black president. First, let me just stop and get your reactions to this chapter. If it's been a while since you've read it, I'll just remind you that she talks that essentially the focus of this chapter is on the topic of so-called voter fraud or voter suppression, depending on your political perspective, will color how you name that. So that's the topic. And she talks about that this discourse on the right got a boost following the Obama election because Obama brought in so many new voters, and there was sort of a moment for the GOP in which there was a kind of, they were anticipating a demographic apocalypse in which, as one of the guys said, who, I don't know who had this great / horrible line. Oh, it was Lindsey Graham. We're not generating enough angry white guys to stay in business for the long term. So, so anyway, that's what the topic is. Comments at the outset, reactions, thoughts, any surprises for folks?
No, just it's pretty topical right now.
I'll take it from yours.
Yeah, exactly what we're talking about right now. Voter
That's
suppression.
right.
So thought it was actually.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, and that's it. It really, I mean, one of the things that is alarming about the if you look at the current debate in light of what she writes in this book, then you have this idea of voter suppression, but now it's kind of jumped the rails from just being about minorities to being about Democrats in general, because everyone's going to use the postal service to vote. It's not going to be biased racially. It's just going to be about who's for the president, who's not for the president. Yeah, very topical. In this, I don't know how old this book is. 2015. I forgot that she said in the first chapter, 14, 15, something like that. And but yes, it's very, 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 very timely. So let me just, I guess my guess is, folks, I doubt anybody here, based on the people I know, I doubt anybody here found this to be an outrageous misrepresentation. You probably mostly agreed with her. Is that accurate? So
I find it outrageous, but not a misrepresentation.
Say it again.
I find it outrageous,
Right.
but
Right.
not a misrepresentation.
Right. You didn't find her outrageous. Right. Correct. I will say this, and then I just want to point to a couple of things that I was just digging around, that I had some questions about. I will say this, that I was, if I was just surprised at how concerted and widespread and national the effort was. I don't think, until I read this book, I don't think I understood that the attempt to cut back against minority and African American people of color voting, I did not understand that it was part of a national strategy, a coordinated strategy that, differed by state. The specifics differed by state, depending on the laws of the state, et cetera, et cetera. But she gives such extensive evidence that it seems very, very hard to not see it as a concerted national strategy. Yes, sir.
Consider gerrymandering, 3 decades worth of it.
Yeah.
Same focus.
Yes.
National.
Yeah, that's right. And again, the thank you for saying that. And the power and the I think what's important about her book, because other people and other organizations have written about voter suppression, but what she's doing is she's creating a narrative that goes back to the post-Civil War era, and she wants to create a narrative in which you see these as not random, ideas of craven political operatives that came out of nowhere at 2 a.m. and they wake up and they write it down and they call their office the next morning, but rather as a concerted effort of white folks to rob power from people of color that goes back to the 1860s and 1870s. And I mean, obviously before that, but she starts in the post-Civil War era. So one thing I just wanted to point out, I totally, I mean, this is, I accept her broader argument, but I just want to point out that, that, for example, Wisconsin took another, she talks about the fact that Scott Walker tried to require government-issued photo ID and then proceeded to close the Department of Motor Vehicles in areas with Democratic voters. That is true, and it's also true that they ended up not doing that, because their argument was that it was not deliberate, it was not intended to do this, which of course that would be their argument anyway. But when they were challenged on it, they stopped. They said, okay, all right, we won't do that. So that's one thing. The other thing is that, why did I highlight this? Oh, right. This footnote does not offer any evidence about Texas at all. It's a bad link. I don't think she's trying to be deceitful, but she offers no evidence that that this is where one could actually research this thing about Texas. This footnote takes you to an article that discusses Wisconsin.
Should be putting up if you're looking at a page on the.
Oh
Are you
gosh,
looking
I'm
at a
so
page
sorry.
in the book?
I hate when I do that. I do that all the time. Sorry.
Mhm.
Sorry. So I was just saying this was the Wisconsin thing. So Wisconsin actually backed off of that. They did not go through with closing the Department of Motor Vehicles. Then she talks about this issue in Texas where there are no ID issuing offices in a third of its counties. This footnote that she cites as evidence of that does not have an article about Texas at all. It actually points you to a thing about an article about Wisconsin. This article does not mention Texas, so there's no way to verify what she says there. And my point here is not to undermine her argument because in general, I accept it. I just, at a couple of points, I just did some deep diving and I found some things that I didn't agree with completely. The other thing is that one thing that I dug around about Florida's infamous attempts to challenge people's right to vote. In this case, it's actually worse than she makes it out to be. I don't know if how clearly you remember this part of it, but the Florida Secretary of State flagged 180,000 voters who he said were possibly suspicious and had to be looked into. The Florida Secretary of State narrowed that 180,000 down to 2,600, and eventually there were only 85 people who they've determined should have been removed. What's actually worse than she says is that they sent letters to 2,600 Floridians requiring them to testify to their legitimacy as voters. So they got a letter and they had to say, yes, I'm a citizen or whatever it said, and they had to send it back. So I imagine that some percentage of those people, because of ignorance or whatever on their criminal record or who knows, probably that may have stopped them from voting or they didn't send it back. And in any event, the notion that somebody should have to take an affirmative step to prove, in order to vote is horrific. So through all of that effort and all of that debate and all of the legal wrangling, 85 names out of Florida's 12 million voters gives you a voter fraud rate of 0.0, I did the math here, 0.0000007% of illegitimate ballots in the state of Florida. And they put a huge amount of energy into this. So just completely stunning, completely stunning. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll leave you alone with all this stuff, that she talks about this horrific case in Alabama in which there was a councilman named Ernest Montgomery whose district was redrawn, and it caused the percentage of African Americans to go from 69 to 29%. Well, I dug around a little bit, and I don't know very much about this, but I do know that the population of his district doubled over the previous decade, and I believe that the great majority of people who moved into his district were white. So it was the district was readjusted because the population had more than doubled. So again, I'm not making an argument that there's not a problem with voter suppression. I'm just pointing out that, I guess I'm just trying to demonstrate we need to read everything we read really critically, because especially when somebody's processing, 5,000 different sources, they're going to make mistakes, and you want to dig around. So, but in general, the pattern is pretty clear and pretty horrific. And I guess the main thing I wanted to draw out of this chapter is this case of Shelby County versus Holder. So the case was based on, as I just said, a picture that I think is more complicated than she presents it as being. However, the larger constitutional issue, the larger legal issue, is not about the actual why the districting line was redrawn. It's about whether states would still be required to submit any district changes for approval to the Department of Justice, which is what the Voting Rights Act required. This county completely ignored that requirement. They blew it off. And then post facto, the Supreme Court found that it was okay that they did that, because now in the Supreme Court, I think John Roberts' opinion, the country's changed a lot and we no longer need to do that. Or no, sorry, he said the South had changed a lot. What was his phrase?
Whatever it was.
No, I can't find the exact phrase, but he says that essentially he says that we don't live in the same, the South is not the same as it used to be. And I'm belaboring this because I think that that's such an essential point of disagreement, that you can even extend beyond the South in terms of our country. I think that there are people who believe, I mean, I guess that there are some people who I guess would say that our country was never racist, although that seems to be a ludicrously difficult argument to maintain. I think most people would say, yes, our country has a history of racism, but we're not that country anymore, right? I think the debate about race in our country is mostly about that. We don't, people are no longer racist. Maybe here and there you've got some nuts, but for the most part, we're not racist anymore. It's a different country, and therefore we can stop talking about it and we can get rid of affirmative policies, etc. And we don't have to talk about African Americans as a group anymore. We just need to move on. And then, of course, there are other people who clearly the author of this book, who says, no, that's a false narrative. And she's trying to correct that narrative and trying to demonstrate that racist politics, policies, and economics are as hard at work in our country now as they ever have been, and they just have a different voice now. Harvey, you had your hand up.
And yet, within a week or two of that ruling, about half a dozen of those very same states instituted suppression of the vote in the very same way that the reason why the whole thing was put in. Anyway.
Right. Yeah, that's right. So yeah, and unsurprisingly, right, that's precisely why that's what was at stake for the country. So you're pointing to this part. Immediately following the ruling, Arizona, Arkansas, Florida, Iowa, Kansas, Mississippi, North Carolina, Texas, and Virginia all passed a compendium of voter suppression laws because they no longer had to clear it with the Department of Justice. In the wake of that ruling by the Supreme Court, they could now make changes that didn't have to be approved by a federal organization and federal jurisdiction. So this was in 2014. So this is the Obama administration. So right, states that want to change these laws don't want to go up against Eric Holder and the Department of Justice under Obama. And so they felt they were free now to act in a way they had not been previously. Yeah. So, she doesn't really spend, I don't mean this as a criticism, just as a fact, she doesn't put a lot of time into demonstrating the emptiness of the claims about voter fraud. But to my knowledge, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, there just is not any evidence of voter fraud that's even worth mentioning when we're talking about 100 million votes or whatever it is. I showed you running the numbers of the Florida the Florida case was 0.000007% of fraudulent votes. So against that background, the evidence that she does give about the desire to make voting more difficult is pretty astonishing. And it also overwhelmingly is targeted not only against, but overwhelmingly targeted against minorities and African Americans. So I was not intending, I was going to shift gears now. I was not intending to spend time on the epilogue, because as I said, it's essentially, seems to me like just a continuation of the previous chapter. It just brings us up to date a little bit. But before we shift gears, are there any questions or comments? I guess now is a good time to talk about the book as a whole. And then I want to shift gears and ask what we can do in terms of furthering our own education of ourselves as white folks and as Jews. But how did the book hit you in general? Would you recommend this book to folks as an important book at this moment, or is this not the kind of book we should be reading? Is it sort of too policy oriented?
Yeah, it should be more widely publicized, especially considering what's been going on this past year. It's just coming to a big ugly head, and I don't know if this pimple's going to pop or it's just going to fester for longer.
But those are both like gross options. I wish there was like another.
Yeah.
But no, I shouldn't make light of what you're saying. Right, I hear you. Yeah, but but just to push back a little bit, because obviously I agree with you, but just to Eric's point, if Donald Trump is kicked out of office, we still have a racial justice problem. We still have a problem with policing. We still have a problem with go down the whole list. So,
but we have a better chance of hoping that it changes. Keeping this administration, it will only get worse.
Right.
It was like the post office general, whatever his name is, this morning on the news was saying, we're not going to get rid of any voting machines because it's already been done. The counting the machines for the post office.
Right.
He said, we won't do any more, but he already did plenty. Yeah. So it's still, we have a better chance of putting our world back together, I hope.
Yeah.
Amen.
Yes, Riva, you've got your, by the way, Riva, I met your beautiful neighbors who own the little quick stop down the street.
Oh, yeah. They're great.
I was in Eli, and we made this connection, and I didn't even realize this. And every time I go into that store, or Hannah goes into the store, we're always so touched by what a beautiful family they are.
Yeah, they're
how
great.
Sweet they are.
Yeah,
anyway, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that, the president has made so many lies this whole time, but now when he's saying it's true that he doesn't want the mail-in voting because, he knows that probably more people who will do absentee ballots are on the Democratic side.
Right.
And so that's why this is definitely voter suppression.
Yeah.
Because other people who are experts in, intervention from other countries say that a paper ballot is the safest ballot there is, other than the computerized voting.
Yeah.
So I really think people need to be educated in all the states that they have to either get their ballot mailed or take it to the county elections office. Drop it off.
I have to say one of the interesting things about all of this political moment for me is, and I think I'm unique in this because I've got kids who are so young. Trying to explain to my kids what is going on at this political moment is so interesting, because it's one thing, like if my boys had been born during the Bush administration, they would have understood that I was not a fan of President Bush, and there were policy differences and da-da-da-da-da. But I'm trying to convey to the kids that they're seeing something in our country that is just unprecedented.
Oh my God.
That's like not really about whether he's a Republican or not is incredibly challenging, because no matter how much we say it, this is their view of American politics. This is what they know. and trying to get them to see that this is, God willing, an exception to what a normal political, nasty fight looks like is really, really challenging. I want to I want to say, okay, so the book that we looked at here is, of course, as I said a couple times now, it focuses on legal rulings, economic policies, politics, voting, theories about voting, etc. And but of course, the debate that's happening within our society right now is not just about policy, right? It's not just about policy. And that's why, Eric earlier used the term woke or wokeness. That's why wokeness is a thing we can talk about. We're talking about a kind of consciousness and an understanding of what goes on day to day in our country. And pivoting a little bit from this book to a broader set of questions about what does it mean to be an ally right now. I think we're all kind of exploring together. So I wanted to share some resources and some ideas with you, because the only thing I know at this point, clearly as a well-intentioned, privileged white person in our society, is that I just want to learn. I don't even know enough about what I ought to be doing except to be learning. So many of these resources I'm going to show you, I sent out to the congregation, I don't even know, a month and a half ago, maybe 2 months ago. And many of them were given to me by, in my office, Ilana, Cloud, and Amber, who I'm lucky enough to work with. And they had put together a bunch of resources that I essentially forwarded to folks. But I will get them in front of us. And I can actually, I'll put this link in the chat room. Hold on one sec. So this, you all see on my screen right now? So Ilana and Amber did not put this together. They referred me to this. Let me see who, yeah, so this was put together by somebody named Sarah Sophia Flicker and Alyssa Klein in May of this year. So we're not going to go through everything here because there's a ridiculous amount, but I will put the Google Doc link in here, and it's constantly being updated. So I'm putting it in right now. So the list is actually a little bit different than when I copied bits of this and forwarded to the congregation. As I said, this one has been updated a little bit. And I guess there's another link here that you can use. I'm not sure why they would have two different ones, but I'm putting that link as well in the chat room. Okay. Whoops, that's going to be confusing. Okay, so what's great is that it has resources for parents or grandparents, books, podcasts, articles, etc. There's also some really excellent short form stuff from different magazines and online resources, and like the Atlantic. Do people know this name, Ibrahim Kendy? Yeah, some folks are nodding their heads, some folks do not know his name. He's a writer. This is an essay he wrote in the Atlantic. It's very, very short, but he has a couple of books. He has a book called How to Be an Anti-Racist, which was people really loved. There's another one he wrote, and I can't remember the name, that was more of a history of anti-racism in America that I read. But this has great resources. And again, you don't have to write these down now because I put the link in the chat box of this phone call, of this Zoom call, that has videos. Robin DeAngelo, I'm going to come back to her in just a moment. There's podcasts, including the 1619 podcast from the New York Times. And then books. And, you know, this is just a small taste of the possibilities. There's a beautiful range. By the way, I just reread The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. I don't know if people have read that book, but that's a beautiful, incredible, short little, very, very powerful book by James Baldwin. And then there's movies, etc., to watch, and then organizations. Now, the reason these are so powerful, the organizations, is that they'll let you know about current debates that are unfolding now and actions that you can take right now, either locally or nationally. One thing that I will say is there is a little bit of a technological hurdle once you move into the question of what can I do now politically. There's a little bit of a technological hurdle because there's a lot of this stuff that takes place on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, as you can see, especially Twitter and Instagram. And for some of you, I know that's not a no-brainer. And even for me, you know, for me, it's not a no-brainer, some of this stuff. I feel like I'm ancient when I try to engage with some of this stuff. But, you know, if you're asking the question, like, what is being discussed today and what action can I take today? You know, for example, like if you want to know about what marches are happening in Portland or protests, you really need to be looking at Instagram and Twitter, because that's where the stuff is being communicated, in my experience anyway. Anyway, then there's additional stuff here. So these are incredible resources. I encourage you to take these, copy these links and share them with folks that you know. So that's one thing. The other thing I wanted to share with you, and this gets, Cheryl, to what I was saying to you earlier. One second. Nope, that's not what I wanted. Okay. Okay, so are you seeing this thing that says here, are you still reeling? Okay, so this is just an example. So this is from a web page called Welcome to the Anti-Racism Movement that's on medium.com. And I'm using this not because I think it's particularly great, but because I'm using it as an example of something that we have to, white folks who want to be allies have to harden ourselves a little bit. And I've discovered this because, let me just give you an example of what I mean here. Hi, little man, welcome back. I'm glad to see you. Can't wait to hang out with you. Hold on. Where did it go? Hold on. Okay, so this is just a little example of what I mean. So this is written by a person of color, and she's writing white folks who are seeking out, how do I help? And she says, I'm glad you're here. And then she says, I mean, I'd really rather you arrive sooner. And I'm a lot resentful at how often we have to stop this class to cover all the material for people who are just now realizing that this is a class that they should be taking, but better late than never, I guess. So well-intentioned white folks who want to be helping might expect that when they go to websites like this, there's going to be something that says, hey, welcome, thank you so much for wanting to do the right thing, and here's how you can help, and yasher koach for doing the right thing. I'm pointing this out because in my experience, this is not singular. There is a lot of this kind of language that almost seems like it's attempting to make a point that's like, people of color do not need to pat you on the back and thank you because you ought to have been doing this a hell of a long time ago. And I'm not pointing my finger at you, I'm pointing the finger at me. I reached out to an organization early on here in Portland It was Resolutions Northwest, because they do really interesting work, and I wanted to have them come to Portland and come to our shul and engage in a dialogue and tell me and other white folks, like, what can we do? How can we help? And I got no response at all. And I emailed again, and I got something that was not quite as sharply worded as this, but was very similar. It basically said, we're really busy. We're focusing on people who have been allies for some time. We are glad you reached out, but you need to educate yourself and then try to reconnect with our organization later. It was not exactly a welcome mat. And I'm saying that because I just think it's fascinating, and B, because I don't want folks who are reaching out to be off-put, because all of us, these are very fraught conversations, and you're making yourself vulnerable when you reach out, and I wouldn't want anyone to feel shut down, but this is something that you can expect in my experience. Let's see, I was going to show you a bunch of other things, but all of these are links that you can get to from that first sheet that I laid out there for you, this one. So I won't belabor it, and just pause there and see if you've had your own experiences of trying to connect and trying to learn, and what that's been like, and if you have any specific recommendations. Sounds like we all have a lot of work to do. I certainly do.
Absolutely.
I'm in an odd position in my life where I probably have access to being able to financially help people more than I have been in the past. And it hasn't been my way of saying to help people through most of my life, but it's like, send money.
Right.
Plus, it's expensive to do this stuff.
Right.
If you look through the book we've been reading, it's like, like one way of abusing power is you just bankrupt everybody that that you want to suppress.
Right.
And so I've been, just, hopefully very carefully looking at, what are the organizations
That's great.
that are, kind of like boots on the ground,
Yep.
doing something, since I'm not going to be able to put my boots on the ground this
Right.
year.
That's great.
And
Yeah.
pay for people to do that.
Yep. That's fabulous. That's great. Good for you. That's definitely a powerful way to help. One thing I do want to talk about, I meant to mention earlier, was White Fragility. Has anybody read the book White Fragility? Cheryl, you have? So
Just the article, not the book.
you've seen the lecture or something?
Right.
So yeah, it's mentioned here, and I'm just mentioning this because I have not read it, but I listened to part of what she said on a podcast, and I didn't like it. Doesn't mean it's wrong. It could be my own hung upness. It could be whatever. But I also read a really interesting article in The Atlantic by an African American man who loathed the book, and this is totally aside. She's come under a bunch of personal criticism for some lack of transparency, or who knows. I don't quite know what the argument is. This is separate from that. This is about, there are critiques of her approach. One of the things that I didn't like about White Fragility, or her discussion of White Fragility, I should say, was there was almost like a religiosity to it. It was almost like, if you disagree with me, you disagree with me because you're so racist that you can't really understand that you're that you ought to agree with me. But having said that, I have not read it. I've only heard her talk about it. But I'm pointing it, the reason I'm highlighting poor Robin DiAngelo, who's had such a miserable month, is that because even, so she's a white woman who grew up dirt poor, and she's made it her life mission to be an ally. So she's got a huge heart, and whether you like her ideas or not, she's coming from a very good place. That even that book has come under fire from at least one African American man who feels like it is, not a good argument. It's a damaging argument. And my point is that, on all of this stuff, there's a range of opinions by everybody, and it's as complex as any other topic. But what we all know is that we don't have to turn ourselves into experts on anything, but we need to see ourselves as inheritors. If you buy the arguments that Carol Anderson made, and I do, we have to see ourselves as inheritors. And sometimes white-skinned Jews are insiders, and sometimes we're outsiders. And when we're talking about race and racial justice, we are insiders in this society. And we're inheritors of a legacy of a lot of racist policies that have been at work in our country for a couple of hundreds of years. And so as we delve into this and learn and deprogram ourselves and try to get our heads on straight and try to be good listeners, we don't have to become experts in the field, but we do need to take some first steps and to be courageous and be willing to learn things that are hard, be willing to not necessarily be embraced with open arms by African Americans who think we're the greatest thing ever because we want to help, and put on our big boy pants or our big girl pants and get to it, because there's a lot of work to be done. That's all I've got. I want to thank you. If you have suggestions for other books or lectures or topics for us to continue this kind of conversation, I would love to have them emailed to me. This one was very, as I said, very policy oriented, very political. If we're going to do another one, I'd love to move in a different direction. But in any event, if you've got ideas, send them to me. I'd love to see them.
Sounds like we should do white fragility.
Right. Actually, yeah. Maybe that's not a bad idea. Somebody had recommended how to be an anti-racist, but white fragility is really interesting.
Yeah. I really like how to be an anti-racist. I want to bring up a question here that I don't think I ever hear anybody talk about, and it seems so central to me that I think people must be like purposely looking away. And I read a book like this one, right? Rage. You read through the history, which is, not at all complete in that book. And like what goes through my mind is pogroms. This is what for many of us, our ancestors, left Eastern Europe to escape. Exactly. It's exactly what we left. And I believe that, one of the reasons that the United States has been a relatively safe place for Jews is because the hatred is easily put on to Black people.
Oh, interesting.
They're even more obviously other than we are. And
right.
So to me, although it took me a long time to kind of realize this, like the idea of I'm not a racist, and of course I'm not, but I benefit from the history of this, the racist history of this country. It's like when I really think about it, it's like I really benefit. I benefit every time I walk out the door and somebody doesn't shoot me.
Right.
And so, to me, there's just like this deep, deep, deep moral obligation for Jews in America to, really fight this. All those martyrs, that we talk about, they died so you can walk out your door without being shot.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting. I do think that, listen, I mean, Jews have a lot of good reasons to say that the United States was a godsend. Right? I mean,
Yeah.
centuries of a kind of brutality that very few other people have known, uninterrupted brutality came to an end at the shores of the United States in many ways for us. And that's no small thing. And none of us should take it for granted. And our children and our grandchildren ought to know that that's part of our history and that's real. And so what you're saying really resonates, because how can that be true and everything we've just read also be true? And I think the ability, I think somebody who just says, well, the United States is as evil as every other country, that's just not interesting or useful to me, because it doesn't reflect our experience as a people. And it's also true that all of this, that Carol Anderson laid out this argument about the fundamental racism that's been unceasing in our country for a long time. So how do Jews hold both of those things at the same time? Maybe by trying to make this country for other folks what it was for us.
Yeah. The other thing I want to bring up that's to me related to this is, we're a very lovely, nice group of people. That I'm very proud and happy to be part of. But we do not, in our little Zoom room, represent everybody. And there's racist Jews everywhere. And there's blatantly racist Jews. Who are like really happy that Trump's in the White House. And we're so glad that he was, redlining in his buildings.
Right.
And there's lots and lots and lots of, I'm not a racist Jews.
Sure.
Who, and I think, we really have to cop to that.
Yeah, you're right. That's right. There is racism in the Jewish community, just like there is in every community. And I've seen it. I've witnessed it. Riva, your son speaks with some great energy about being exposed to it. It really wounds him or wounded him whenever he came across it. So yeah, that's something that we carry, and it just won't do. It won't do to say, well, listen, our people have been through so much, and so we carry scars. That's not going to cut it. Not at this moment. So, what we can say is that the very best of Jewish teaching demonstrates that our own history teaches that our hearts should be wide open in trying to bring in more goodness. So. Two things. Jemmy put down a link in there, which I didn't, but a video that she said is an interesting show to watch.
Right, so it's the Glenn Show, and this is something that Julie Diamond from OJCF sent to me and Rabbi, and it's these two African-American men discussing white fragility and why it outraged them so, and it was such an interesting 45-minute show to listen to. I then went on to the next one. Of course, I'm listening because I'm working while I'm listening, because I'm always working. But it's really interesting to hear people, outside of our community, within their community, talking about where we read and go, oh my gosh, I never realized that. To hear them saying, this is not representative, and this is not what we all feel.
Interesting.
And also, you talked about Resilience Northwest, Rabbi. You and I attended that white supremacy seminar a couple months ago, and the one I was on, we had technical difficulty, and so they said, You can attend it again, or you can attend a different one. So I attended one called Are You Karen? And I didn't know who Karen was until like earlier this year, before any of the racial tensions, really arose. My 20-year-old son had to wake me up to what Karen was. It was a really, really good discussion, talking about what we say with, well, I can't possibly be racist because I'm Jewish, or all those things about interrupting racism and how you approach, well, not all cops are bad, or I know a Karen who's very nice.
Right.
That was a great discussion. And so that kind of thing, I think, where some of us are dipping our toes into recognizing where we have profited or, done well, not even realizing that all the racism that's come behind our successes. That's a good discussion to go on.
Great. What was that at Resolutions Northwest?
Yes.
Great. So Resolutions Northwest is, and Sarah Sturt's here next. Resolutions Northwest is a local organization that does a lot of really interesting stuff. They're the organization I mentioned that I was expecting the red carpet to be rolled out to me because I'm such a nice white person, and they were not that friendly. But anyway,
no, it's not that they're not friendly. They are challenging.
Yeah, that's a better way to put it. They're challenging. Yeah, and they don't accept the notion that I should be patted on the head and get a cookie for wanting to fight racism. But in any event, it's a local organization. They do a lot of really great work, and you can Google them and get to their website. Sarah Sturts?
Yeah, before I tell you what was on my mind, I'm just thinking that when you're someone in our position as white people who try to learn what the issues are and to come down solidly on the side of our traditions and our teaching and our ethics, it's very, what do I want to say, tiresome to have people turn up at your doorstep with no background, no preparation, ready to say, here I am, teach me.
Right.
Teach me everything. It's difficult.
Right.
When my boys were little, there was a movie whose name I don't remember, which said you can't put too much information in a human's brain because our brains leak. And I feel like I'm leaking. I've been having difficulty trying to prioritize which fire needs my little hose at one time or another.
Yeah. Yep.
Which doesn't take away, in fact, it adds to the urgency with which all of these issues need to be addressed. For myself, I'm very impressed with the people who have read. The fact that I know the titles of these books is pretty impressive. The fact that I've read some of this and some of that is impressive.
Right.
But I don't know it all. So while I'm looking at the White House on one hand and these issues on the other and trying to figure out where do I put my attention?
Yeah.
And the answer is everywhere. What I want to learn is how to recognize unconscious racism in my behavior, in my speech, because that's one thing that I can do and I can work on.
Yeah, that's right.
And I will. I forgot what the other thing is.
But no, I'm very
that's what I want to do.
Sense of being overwhelmed, and there's so many.
Cheryl, you talked about making donations, and I totally agree with you. To the extent that any of us can, there's lots of places that need our support. Right now, despite everything I've heard tonight and my desire to find a good recipient that makes sense to me, I keep on looking at the ACLU because every time I say, how could he do that? Somebody should sue.
Right.
They're my somebody.
Right.
They're my somebody. They're the ones who I feel are acting on my behalf. I need to guide some of my passion and outrage about what's going on in the Black community, and I live in the heart of the Black community, to where it will do the most good. So I've taken down the notes.
Good.
And I've copied what you said, Jenny. And then I will spend my time trying to figure out what is going to help me help the situation.
Right.
That's
Well,
what I wanted to say.
yeah. Well said, well said. I mean, look, I think that one of our, and I'll close on this because I've got to get off the phone and get off the call, but I think that one of the challenges that we have is not being overwhelmed, you know, because there's so many different things. I mean, even in a normal year, and I don't consider us to be in a normal year, there's always so many things vying for our attention. And there's part of us that kind of wants to go into our turtle shell in that kind of situation and just turn everything off. As long as we don't do that, it's okay. And knowing that, you know, that famous passage from Pirkei Avot, it's not your obligation to finish the work, but you're not permitted to desist from it. If we kind of keep that in mind and do what we can do and things like this and educating ourselves, then that's what we can do. So thank you all for taking time to be on this, and copy down those links if you want them before we go. If you missed them or you can't figure out how to do it, you can email us and we can get them to you. Thanks so much.
Coming in tomorrow.
Yep.
Thanks. Bye, everyone. Good to see you all.